Could you state your name?
My name is Nigel Nicolson.
And Mr. Nicholson, were you part of the British Army in World War II?
Yes, I was in the Grenadier Guards, which is an infantry unit or regiment. And for some time I served as a platoon commander, and then I became brigade intelligence officer of the 1st Guards Brigade as a captain. And it was in that capacity that I served when the 8th Army entered Austria at the end of the World War II.
How old are you now, Mr. Nicholson?
I'm 71 now.
And where's your place of birth?
I was born in London.
In London.
Mm-hmm.
You say that you were in the 6th Armored Division?
Yes. The 6th Armored Division was one of the 3 divisions which comprised the 5th Corps of the 8th Army. And it was the 5th Corps was the only formation to be present in southern Austria in May, June 1945.
And what were your responsibilities as intelligence officer?
Well, I was primarily concerned with collecting and disseminating information. That is, finding out what was going on among our own troops and informing rear headquarters of what was occurring at the front, and also bringing information down from the rear to these forward troops, to the battalions, so that I was a channel of information. But I also had a role to transmit orders received from above to the officers in the battalions who had to carry them out. But I had no executive role. It was my business to inform myself about the dispositions of our own troops and of the enemy or allied troops, and to spread that information around to everybody who needed to have it.
Going back to Corinthian in May of 1945, you recorded in your personal papers or in your sitrep that you wrote in for the 6th Armored Division that you were assigned, in your within your direction of in the 6th Armored Division in the Carinthia area, specifically Victory, that there are approximately 11,000 Croatians under your responsibility, or in the responsibility of your division at that time. Is that true?
Yes, it was the responsibility of the 1st Guards Brigade, which was one of 3 brigades in the 6th Armored Division. And we held the central slot, which was the territory south of Klagenfurt in the Wörthersee, up to the Yugoslav frontier, particularly the Leubel Pass, where the main road from Klagenfurt to Ljubljana ran. And that included about a score of villages and a few small towns like Belden and Thalach. And when we began receiving vast numbers of refugees from the Yugoslavia, we established camps for them, of which the most important, holding about 30,000 men, women and children, was at a village called Victory, which was just south of Klagenfurt. And that camp, and 1 or 2 minor ones, became the responsibility of our brigade.
Were you given orders on May 18th from Corps headquarters to the effect that all Croatians in the area who were in the area at the time should be sent to Rosenbach via the Welsh Guard Brigade, and that they in turn would be turned over to Tito's partisans?
Yes, of course, the orders didn't come direct to us from Corps. It came down the chain of command, and so we received the orders from 6th Armoured Division. And we first got the order to which you refer on the 16th of May, but told not to put it immediately into action. And it was acted upon 3 days later, on the 19th of May, when we began to evacuate from Rosenberg and another small train station called Maria Elland the first batches of the Croats. And then for the next 5 days, we organized train loads of Croats to go to Yugoslavia. And as soon as we cleared the Croats out of our area, they were followed up by the Serbs and the Slovenes, who were also held in the victory camp. And the whole operation of evacuating each people lasted from the 19th to the 31st of May. Every day, trainloads of these Yugoslavs would depart for Yugoslavia under our organization. And the Welsh Guards was the battalion stationed at or near these two railway stations, and they formed a staging camp where the Yugoslavs were placed before being loaded onto the trains the next day. That was all done by the Welsh Guards under the ultimate command of my brigadier. And I was constantly at these two railway stations and at the main camps, watching and reporting about the whole of this process.
Were the repatriated Croatians and other ethnic groups called at the time anti-Yugoslavs, were they to be told exactly what the destination was?
No. We received specific orders from our division that they weren't to be told where they were going. Or, and then as naturally, they were very anxious that they shouldn't be sent back to Yugoslavia and suspected us. We were told a little later, only a few days later, that we were to tell them definitely they were going back to Italy. In the case of the Serbs, to join their friends, other Chetniks, at Palmanova in northeast Italy. And this lie, which we told with the greatest reluctance, was ordered from above. And of course, if they'd learnt the truth, that they were going back to Yugoslavia where they didn't expect to survive, none of them would have consented to mount the railway trucks. But as they trusted us that we were telling them the truth, there wasn't much trouble about loading them on.
Do you recall?
And it's one of the things, it's one of the most disgraceful operations the British troops have ever been asked to undertake. And we felt that at the time, and many of us expressed it at the time. I expressed it in writing, in a public document, and was reprimanded for doing so. But the evidence from officers who were engaged upon this dastardly act is overwhelming. But our feelings about it, which were of course reported to higher headquarters, had no effect upon the operation, which was continued until all these people had been sent back to Yugoslavia, as we knew almost for certain at the beginning, meant to their death. And if there was any doubt in our mind about it, we were confirmed in that supposition by the escape of 2 or 3 men who'd been loaded onto the trucks and had got over the frontier, seen what was happening on their arrival, and escaped and came back to warn their fellow countrymen and the British officers what was happening.
What was your reaction when you heard?
But it simply confirmed what we'd been suspecting all the way along. And we sent these people to the higher headquarters, right up to the General Keatley, commanding 5th Corps. But either he didn't believe them, or else he thought that the necessity to carry out the orders he was given from further up were dominant. And look, one mustn't be too sentimental about the fate of something like 30,000 people, including women and children, when the whole of Europe was in a turmoil.
Wasn't it General Keatley that made the remark that the Croats should be Tito's show?
Say that again, a feeling what?
Wasn't it Keatley who made the remark that the Croatian people should be Tito's show?
Well, that wasn't actually Keatley. That remark was made by the 8th Army commander, General Richard McCreary. But he was only referring to the Croats. There was some justification for returning the Croats to Tito because they had been fighting all through the war in alliance with Germany. In fact, they could have been called traitors to their state. And
to the Yugoslav
the same thing didn't apply to the Serbs and the Slovenes, and particularly the Chetniks, who were engaged in a civil war against communism inside the major war of Germany against Yugoslavia. It was a very confused situation, and at the time, of course, we didn't completely understand it.
Were there, in addition to the soldiers that you just mentioned who could be considered traitors, as you say, to Yugoslavia, were there also women and children in with the people that were...
Yes, there were women and children and old men and sometimes babies who were in these convoys which we organized. But in the victorying camp, we had managed to separate most of the women and children from their menfolk and put them in a separate part of the camp. And there were 6,000 of them. And we were ordered to send them too. I remember asking for advice from the division, are we to send the civilians as well? And the answer came back, yes, if they are camp followers. And then I asked, what is a camp follower? And the reply was, a camp follower is any person, however young or whatever sex, who is dependent upon the soldiery for their maintenance, for their livelihood, I think the word was. Well, that meant everybody, because all the non-soldiers who accompanied the armies were, of course, dependent upon the army for their livelihood. And so they were all to be sent back too. That was the order. But at the very last moment, owing to the intervention of a very bold man with the military authorities higher up, those 6,000 were in fact saved. And the order was countermanded at the last moment. I think it was largely because Alexander had been up on June the 4th to Austria to see what was happening, and discovering how his orders had been interpreted in this brutal way, he put a stop to it at once. And I think that's what saved these particular civilians. But if Alexander had not come up at that time, they would have been on the trains.
Do you recall who it was exactly that designed the method of deception whereby the Croatians and other ethnic groups who were told that they were going to Italy, when in fact...
Who was responsible for the lie?
Design, yes.
Well, I don't know particularly who was responsible. I wouldn't like to accuse anybody, but it probably originated in the core area and not further up. You see, in a sort of way, Alexander had given orders which couldn't be carried out. He said at one moment that nobody must be evacuated against his will, and no force must be used. Well, of course, if people are told the truth about where they're going, and they refuse to go because they will be killed, the only way to get them onto the trains is to lie to them about their destination. And I don't think that Alexander quite foresaw what would happen on the ground. He thought it was a nice formula. Let them go back if they want to. But don't force anybody. And if they had been put to them in that way, they would have all refused to have gone back. So he didn't really give a clear order on that point, and it was the dirty business was left to the corps to circumvent that order by lying to them about their destination.
I've been told by some witnesses who were there that once they did board the cattle cars that were to take them to where they thought was Italy, locks were placed on the outside of the cattle cars, and then they finally did in fact realize that too late maybe that it was all a deception and that they weren't really going to...
But that was perfectly true. These great, they weren't carriages, they were cattle trucks. And there were 60 men piled into each of them. It was rather like the evacuation to the concentration camps in Germany. And they were locked in. And then not until they were securely in the vans did the Tito partisan troops who had been hidden in the station buildings emerge to take over the guarding of them from the British soldiers. And some of the wagons were very old or badly constructed, and there were gaps between the planks. And looking through these cracks, the inmates of these vans could see what was happening and recognize the red star of the partisans. And then they began hammering on the inside of the vans. But of course they couldn't get out because they were locked in. And it was at that moment that there were, in every case, there were several suicides because they knew what it meant. And then the Tito guards mounted the carriages or the vans, and the train pulled out. And it was only a few miles to the frontier. The frontier at that point was crossed on the railway by a very long tunnel. And the northern end of it was in Austria, and the southern end of the tunnel in Yugoslavia. And as we learnt later, or pretty soon afterwards, when the train got through the tunnel, it halted at a small town, and then the murders began.
You say that you'd learned this a short time later. Did you learn that?
Well, we learnt this from the few of the Yugoslav victims who managed to escape. One or two managed to throw themselves out of the train. I don't know how they managed that because they were locked in. I think there was one van with a loose window, and I know at least one man got out that way and just threw himself down the embankment before the train got to the tunnel.
It must have been difficult to watch these people locked inside the cattle car.
Oh, it was absolutely horrifying. And that is why I say now, and felt at the time, that it was such a disgraceful operation. The British troops should never have been asked to undertake. And we couldn't understand the reason why we were ordered to do this. since it could have been perfectly easy to ship all these people. There were only 70,000 of them, and that was a drop in the ocean of the millions who were swarming through Europe. We could have shipped them back to Eisenhower's divisions in Western Austria, or even into Germany, where they could have accommodated them quite easily. And to this very day, of course, nobody knows what the motive for this was. At the time, it was rumored, it was deliberately put about as an excuse for this operation, that it was a quid pro quo, that if Tito agreed to evacuate Carinthia, which he'd been claiming as a province of Yugoslavia, we would hand back these Chetniks and Slovenes and so on, and Croats. But that has been denied, that there was any such a deal. And yet Brigadier Lowe, who now Lord Orlington, who had to deal with this matter at Corps Headquarters, has said that possibly there was such a deal. But if so, no documents or oral evidence has yet been given to sustain that idea.
But at the time, you did believe that?
At the time, I believed it, and even helped to give currency to this rumor.
Do you believe that the job was made possibly easier for the British soldiers, thinking that there was some larger purpose?
Yes, that was the intention. Mm-hmm. At the same time, of course, another operation was going on when we had to surrender the Cossacks to Stalin, to the Russian armies. And there the excuse was that it had all been agreed at Yalta. But another reason was, it was alleged, that if we didn't give back these particular men, the Russians wouldn't give back our own British and American prisoners whom they'd liberated on their way through Europe. Mm-hmm. But that was untrue too.
How would you account, as an intelligence officer who was a captain at the time, you weren't real high level in the British Army, but certainly a captain of intelligence area would know something. How would you account for?
There are two other points which should be made about this whole event. One was that we greatly admired Tito, because we had no reason to distrust him. And the Tito's partisans had fought with extraordinary gallantry, and they were in fact our allies. And so we considered that they were incapable of the atrocities which in fact they perpetrated, because they were supposed to be gentlemen like ourselves. And we were very, very confused at the time about these other Yugoslavs, exactly what their relationship was. And to us they were a lot of Balkan bandits, really, compared to the shining example of Tito's partisans. Now, that was a totally mistaken view, but it was quite widely held at the time. The second point I want to make is that we just successfully concluded a 6-year war. And many of our colleagues had been in action for at least 3 years of those 6 years. I had myself. First in Africa, and then in Italy. And we'd won the war. And we somewhat naturally expected to enjoy a little peace and indeed fun and relaxation after this long haul up. And we found ourselves in a delectable part of Europe. Austria, or southern Austria, was almost undamaged. It had been the playground of Europe. in beautiful weather, May and June, and we were frankly irritated by having the fruits of victory, if you like to call it that, snatched from us by this trouble with the Yugoslavs. And at one moment it looked as if we might have to go to war with Yugoslavia, with Tito, our ex-ally, over this business. And so we were very, very anxious to clear up this mess. And I think that that reconciled a lot of people in the British Army to the fact that the Yugoslavs who had surrendered to us were treated so brutally. They'd become a nuisance. And there were many people who felt, well, so many millions of young men have died in this war. What does another 30,000 matter? I don't say that that view was widely held, but it was an element in the British reaction.
But what I was going to ask you before was, how would you account for the repatriation of Croatians and other so-called anti-Yugoslavs, as they were called in by the British Army at the time? How would you account for their repatriation when, under the Yalta Agreement, they weren't covered as possibly the Soviet citizens were covered?
I'm sorry, you have to say that again. I didn't get the question clear.
How would you account for the repatriation of the Croatians and the other ethnic groups back to Yugoslavia when they were not covered, when that area was not covered under the Yalta Agreement? There was nothing in the Yalta Agreement, I don't believe, that called for
Well, this remains, of course, one of the so far unanswered questions. What was the motive in doing this? Various explanations have been put forward. As you say, there was no obligation to do so under Yalta, but we were facing this very tricky situation vis-à-vis Tito. We might have to fight a war against him, and we didn't want our campaigning ground, southern Carinthia, to be full of people who might turn against us. There was also the administrative problem of how to feed and guard these vast numbers of people. And the third reason was, or the reason that was given, I've already referred to, which was a supposed deal with Tito about handing them back in return for him evacuating the country. Mm-hmm. And but all the same, none of these three, or even in combination, satisfy me as to the reasons why this thing was done, when it was so contrary to the British tradition of safeguarding people, particularly women and children who were refugees, from attack from outside when they'd surrendered to us.
A few weeks following the repatriations, General Keatley is recorded as saying to Lady Limerick of the British Red Cross that there were a considerable number of Yugoslav displaced persons who asked if they could be prepared, when asked if they could return back to Yugoslavia, they expressed that they were quite willing, in fact, and volunteered to return to Yugoslavia. Are you aware of any anti-Yugoslavs that went back?
I never came across any specific there. None are mentioned in my contemporary reports of anything of that kind happening. But I suppose there could have been a handful, a few dozen among many, many thousands who would have elected to go back to Yugoslavia. But if there were such people, they were homesick peasants who knew no other place except their own little patch of land, and were perhaps not bright enough to understand what going back really meant.
If I understand the situation correctly, yes, then the vast majority of those that were sent back were not sent back of their own volition. They did not volunteer to go back.
No, they were deceived into going back by this lie that they were going to be sent to Italy.
Number of people that I've also spoken to that were in the camps at the time, along the same lines of the deception that you referred to earlier, said that there were British officers who spoke to mass crowds of these Croatian people, and some of the things that that these British officers would say was, number one, that they were surrendering to the British Army, and number two, that they would be sent back to camps in Italy by railway. Number three, that they would be trained in Italy as anti-communist fighters. And number four, when they did get there, that they would be provided food and clothing in Italy.
Yes.
Is that basically
well,
what was
you
said?
see, when we were advancing through northeast Italy at the end of the war, we already ran into a lot of the Yugoslav dissidents, Czechniks, a whole division of them. And we interned them in Italy and refused to hand them back. And they were saved. But when we got into Austria, the policy changed. And we did hand them back. But of course in Italy there was no real danger that Tito would attack us. In southern Austria there was such a danger, or that we would have to attack him. It was I never remember at the time many operation orders being given to prepare ourselves to make war on Tito. But this was being seriously discussed at a high level. I mean, right up to President Truman, who was very firm on the subject. And Churchill was involved, of course. And this was before Potsdam. And I think it would have been a very tricky morale situation if British troops in Austria had been ordered to attack Tito, having just finished one war, to start another war against our ally. And Alexander did raise this point with Churchill. When I was writing Alexander's biography, I came across a whole bunch of correspondence on this very subject. And Alexander warned Churchill that British troops would carry out this order with the greatest reluctance. There might even be a mutiny, he hinted. And he was rapped sharply over the knuckles by Churchill for saying that, although it was a purely private message. But fortunately, his fears, which I think were justified, were never put to the test.
You did write a book then on Alexander.
I wrote the official biography of Alexander.
By official biography, you mean for the British government?
No, not authorized by the British government, because we don't have such a process. It was authorized by his widow.
I see.
And his family, because he died before I began the book. And I had written to him 6 months before he died to ask if I could write his life, and he'd agreed. But we hadn't got down to the interviews which I was going to have with him before his death. But his widow honoured his undertaking, and Harold Macmillan backed me up. And so it became, I used the word official just now. I think the word should be authorized.
Okay.
It is, in fact, the only major biography of Alexander which has ever been written. There's not been one since.
Back to that period in May and June of 1945, when these Croatian people and others were repatriated back to Yugoslavia. What was your general impression of the attitude and behavior of the people that were being forced back to Yugoslavia?
When the first major group came over from Yugoslavia, it was on the 12th of May, and there were something like 30,000 in one group under the command of a German colonel called von Seele. And part of this ad hoc force consisted in Wehrmacht soldiers, who were genuine German soldiers who'd surrendered, and they were treated as prisoners of war. And with them there was this motley group, including White Russians, Slovenes, and Serbs and Croats, who were escaping from Tito, from whom they expected ill treatment, quite rightly. And they were accompanied by a great many women and children, and horses and innumerable carts, which had somehow struggled over the Leubel Pass. And we allotted them a large area at Victory. It was really nothing more than a group of fields with no defences round it or anything, where we asked them to make camp. And they were very well behaved, and most of them accepted the von Seeler's directions and of his subordinate officers, and they were very happy at that stage. They were happy to have escaped into Austria under British protection. And very soon they were organizing even schools for the children. And they were running horse races. And there was not, at that time, much problem about feeding them, because Austria was full of food, and ex-German army stores were available. And there was running water, and there were nurses and that sort of thing, and the women looked after the children. And it was like a sort of gold rush camp. And with concerts and festivals and a great deal of religious celebration, because there were many priests among them. And they just were resting after their arduous journey over the mountains. And although they didn't know what was their ultimate destination, they felt secure. And we grew to like them very much. And they were also jolly and gay and grateful and helpful to us. We had no trouble with them. The trouble we had was in preventing Tito's partisans, who followed on their tracks, from breaking into these camps and killing people. And that was why the presence of British soldiers was so necessary. So that was the feeling we had about them at the beginning, and very slowly we began to discover who they were and to sort out their different nationalities and political allegiances.
Did you actually witness that then, where the...
So I was constantly in the camp, yes.
Did you see the...
And talking to the few officers who could speak any language except Serbo-Croat, which I didn't have a word of that, but I could speak German and French. And so it was really one of my jobs to discover who they were, who they'd been fighting, what their history was of these different units, and having discovered that, to sort them out into groups, according mostly to nationality.
Did you witness then yourself the Yugoslav army coming in, the Yugoslav forces?
Well, not a cohesive army, but bands of partisans who were roaming all over the place, right into Klagenfurt itself, where we had our corps headquarters. Mm-hmm. And they were very menacing. And they were still, of course, fully armed, and they'd captured a lot of German arms. And one of our duties was to prevent them from helping themselves to the huge dump of arms which the surrendering Germans had massed up on our orders, and including tanks, artillery. And we had very tactfully, because we didn't want to provoke an incident, to prevent Tito's partisans from helping themselves to these dumps. It was a very tricky situation, and at any moment there might have been an incident which would have led to a sort of mini war on the spot. But fortunately, owing to the good sense of the subalterns and non-commissioned officers on the spot, we avoided that.
Many people have told me, as far as the Croatian army is concerned, when the Croatian army came across the River Drava and headed towards Austria, and they were stopped by the British forces, their first impulse that they report to me was that they were overjoyed. They were happy that finally they could have some sort of protection from the British government.
That's right. But they weren't happy when they were stopped. I was referring just now to the first group of 30,000 that came across, and we let them in. But then orders came down that we weren't to let any more in, because we would be swamped. And so they were held south of the River Drava. And hence occurred, as you well know, the terrible incident of the massacre at Bleiburg. That was only the worst example of this, the results of this new policy. What we were really doing, and let's face it, in refusing to allow the Croats to escape into southern Austria, north of the Drava, we were condemning them to death just as much as when we sent back our victoring prisoners to Tito later.
Mm-hmm.
We knew what would happen to them. If we didn't know, Bleiburg soon put us right.
What were your orders in the case the Croatians decided to force their way past your lines? Were you to shoot?
Well, that possibility occurred once, I remember, in about the 20th of May, when a large group, I think it was about 10,000 Croats, suddenly materialized. I don't know where they'd come from. Perhaps they were refugees from Bleiburg, at a town called Ferlach, just south of the Drava, in our sector. And it looked as though at any moment they would attempt to cross the bridge at Ferlach, which is the main bridge linking Austria to Yugoslavia. And so we quickly radioed for instructions from division. What are we to do if they rush the bridge, where we only had a handful of men and perhaps a couple of tanks guarding it? And the answer came back saying, well, if they try to do that, you must not fire if there are women and children among them. Well, there were women and children, but fortunately it wasn't put to the test, because they settled down at Ferlach, south of the river, discouraged by our menacing appearance. But if they had taken the risk and rushed the bridge, we would not have fired, and those 10,000 Croats would have been in Austria. But even if they'd got that far, we know very well that a few days later they'd have been sent back over the frontier by the train. Mm-hmm. I don't know what their fate was, but one can only imagine that they suffered the same fate as the other Croats.
Knowing what you know now, with some sort of 20/20 hindsight, would you do you believe that you would have carried out the orders that you were giving to repatriate the Croatians back into Yugoslavia, or do you think that possibly you would have questioned the orders at the time, knowing what you know now?
You mean, would I, as a junior officer, have disobeyed orders and risked a court-martial on the grounds of conscience?
Right.
Well, of course, it is a question which has exercised my mind. And sometimes I feel that I should have done that. I had made my protest, and I'd made it in the most public way possible at that time. And by writing it into my daily situation report, which had a wide circulation, and I said that this is a an operation which British soldiers are carrying out with infinite distaste.
Mm-hmm.
And for writing that and giving it this semi-public circulation, I was sent for by the divisional commander, General Murray, who said to me, "I don't disagree with what you wrote, but you should never have published it in that way." And he ordered me to modify it in my next day report, which, to my shame, I did. I said the next day, it looks as if the Yugoslavs are keeping, the Tito's men are keeping their word, and that the men we're sending back to him won't be too badly treated. When I knew jolly well, we all knew that they were being treated so badly that very, very few of them survived.
Do you recall any conversations that you had between you and other British officers, British soldiers, concerning how they felt it was an unsafe?
Oh yes, this view of mine was shared by everybody else. I was simply reflecting what was the current talk in the mess,
Mm-hmm.
in the officers' mess. But it wasn't confined to the officers. The Welsh guards, who had the major task of forcing these people into the trains, were at one point almost on the verge of mutiny. They were saying to their officers, "Is this what we fought the war for?" And when one company of the Welsh Guards was relieved by another, a sergeant in the first company who'd been through this just for one day said, "Well, I'm very glad we haven't got to do it again, because I couldn't answer for what the men would do if we were ordered to do this a second time." So they rotated the companies. It was as bad, the feeling was running as high as that.
Can you tell me what was the general behavior of the Yugoslav forces in Carinthia at the time? How did they behave towards the civilians in Austria?
Well, one has to distinguish between the pro and the anti-Tito Yugoslavs.
I'm sorry, the
Tito's
Yugoslavs.
partisans were behaving very badly. I mean, they too had just finished an arduous campaign that had lasted for years, and they saw, now that peace had come, a chance to let off a little steam and enjoy themselves. And they didn't stop at just having a good time and getting a little drunk. They looted quite openly, and they well, there were several incidents when they raped local Austrian girls, and they behaved as an army of occupation, very often does. And the Soviets were doing the same in Eastern Europe at the same time. And they were very arrogant, and they'd been indoctrinated with the idea that Carinthia was now an Austrian province, and that we, the British, had no claim to be there at all. And they put up all these notices to that effect. Well, that was the Tito's partisans, and the anti-Tito people were, of course, relatively cowed. And they had no chance to loot or rape or get tight, because they were under guard in our camps, quite happily.
Do you still have any of those proclamations that you saw the partisan soldiers hanging in the Austrian area?
Let's have that again. Let's draw that curtain.
I understand that you still have the original proclamations in your possession that Tito's soldiers were putting up on the walls throughout Carinthia at the time.
Yes, I have the rival proclamations, the ones which we put up, declaring that we'd entered Austria in order to liberate it, and that we intended to establish it within its own boundaries as a free and independent country. That was what our notice said. And I also have the Yugoslav notice, which was posted up in many cases alongside ours, which said that Carinthia was now declared to be a Yugoslav province of Greater Yugoslavia.
Then is the official document that was hung up on the walls of Corinthia by the partisan soldiers?
Yeah. Do you want me to say that?
No, that's what I'm asking you.
This poster was pasted up on the walls of Klagenfurt on the 12th of May 1945 by Tito's partisans. And it says in summary that Corinthia has been incorporated in Greater Yugoslavia, and that all the citizens of Corinthia must henceforward obey the commands of Tito's local representatives, because he is now he has constituted the military government of liberated Corinthia.
How did the British at the time view this proclamation?
Well, we had another poster.
British answer, British reply.
Yeah, this was the poster which we pasted up alongside the Yugoslav poster, claiming exactly the opposite. It's a message signed by Field Marshal Alexander, which proclaims to the people of Austria that we have entered Austria in order to free her from Germany and to re-establish her as a free and independent country in Europe. Well, of course, the two proclamations were totally contradictory, each of us claiming to be the liberators of Austria. And while we weren't claiming that Austria would, or Corinthia would be part of the British Empire, Tito was claiming that it was already part of the Yugoslav Empire. And so the citizens of Klagenfurt and other villages, because every village had this posted up, of course didn't know what to do. And naturally, except for a handful of Slovene exiles in southern Austria, they wanted to obey the Alexander order, not the Tito order. And they were appealing to us as soon as these proclamations were put up to save them from the partisans, and surreptitiously they would tear down the Tito proclamation and leave our proclamation in place.
Weren't the citizens of Klagenfurt also appealing to the British Army for your assistance after quite a number of them had been raped and pillaged by the partisans?
They were appealing to us for protection against pillage, and in a few cases, but there weren't very many, against rape and incidents of that kind. Mm-hmm. And of course, with our few numbers over such a wide area, it wasn't possible to do more than establish a platoon or a company in a town or a village. And we did what we could, but there were terrible incidents which took place in the province, which we couldn't prevent or only heard about afterwards.
There'll be probably a number of Croatians who were there under your command, who were in Bleiburg as well as Victorin camp, who had been repatriated back to Tito's Yugoslavs, and who later escaped from death marches, and who now probably will be watching you on this film. Is there anything that you would like to say to them as somebody who did send them back although I'm not, I hate to place the blame on any person, but as,
well, I think I've already
one person to another,
expressed my view forcibly that it was a disgraceful operation, the reason for which we didn't understand, and which to this very day I don't know. And perhaps in the course of the next year, when this matter is debated in a very public manner, in fact in a court of law probably, the truth may emerge. about who was ultimately responsible for this nefarious order. But all I could say to the people who suffered under it is that sympathy is really too mild a word to express my regret for what had happened. And as a serving officer, I do take my share of the blame for it. But I was serving in a very junior capacity. And I did, as I told you, make my public protest against what was happening. If I had carried my protest to the extent of refusing to carry out the order, or my tiny part of the orders, I would, of course, have been replaced by somebody who would have carried out the same order, and I would have been court-martialed. But sometimes I do think that I should have done that. But I was one of many hundreds of junior-ranking officers who were engaged in this, and there wasn't one who took that ultimate step. Although I think every one of us considered doing so at the time.